In addition, I'm serving my fifth term as president of Tabor 100. Tabor 100 is an association working to further economic power, educational equity, social equity for African Americans and the community at large. In 2016, I was appointed by Governor Jay Inslee to the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. In all of those roles, I have seen up close how the legacy of our failed war on drugs, and in particular, convictions and arrests for misdemeanor marijuana possession, have closed off opportunities for our community, particular men and women of color. Bottom line, if all misdemeanor marijuana charges are expunged in Seattle, that means that all misdemeanor offenses that occurred in Seattle would not count against minorities or people with misdemeanor convictions on new license applications. Currently, an application gets 2 misdemeanor freebies, and before they start earning points toward an 8-point system on whether or not they are able to get licensed within the state. Until a third misdemeanor would generate 4 points, and that would have automatically disqualified anyone from being able to apply for new license in Washington State. So I'm excited to be here today as Mayor Jenny Durkan and City Attorney Pete Holmes make an announcement that I believe would do a lot to lower those barriers to economic opportunities across our community and right the wrongs of the past. Now, it is my honor to introduce the 56th Mayor of Seattle. And I must add, the first woman to lead our city in more than a century. Mayor Durkan entered office on November the 28th of 2017 with the challenge of making Seattle affordable and inclusive for all. Prior to becoming our mayor, Mayor Durkan was a civil leader and nationally recognized attorney. From 2009 to 2014, she served as the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington, becoming the first openly gay U.S. Attorney in our country history. Mayor Durkan.
Thank you very much, Ollie, for that introduction. And I want to take just a moment before talking about why we're here to recognize both Ollie for her years of leadership. You know, it's interesting that as she's ended up on the board of the Liquor and Cannabis Control Board, she's worked so long for economic opportunity in this city, particularly in communities of color. And the Tabor 100 has been an unflagging advocate for that kind of opportunity. And she sees probably more than anyone the intersection between drug convictions and opportunity. I also want to recognize Reverend Willis, who's here, and Reverend Broughton for all they've done for our community. Reverend Harriet Walden and Lisa Dugard, who has been an unflagging advocate to make our system of justice more just. And of course, President Harrell and Pete Holmes. Each of them have provided leadership on these issues literally for decades, as we'll be talking about. So I just want to say we would not be standing in here today without the leadership of all the people who are standing here today. I want to thank everyone for being here. Today we are announcing that the City of Seattle will be asking the Seattle Municipal Court to vacate convictions and dismiss charges for all misdemeanor marijuana possession. For thousands of people in Washington State, a misdemeanor marijuana conviction had huge implications. It could be a barrier to housing, to getting credit, to getting good jobs, and an education. This will allow people not just to ban the box, but they can check they do not have a conviction after this is done. It is really a necessary step to right the wrongs of what was a failed war on drugs. The war on drugs ended up being more of a war on people who needed help, who needed opportunity, and who needed treatment. We did little to stem the tide of the supply of drugs and instead incarcerated almost an entire generation of users who could have had a different way. It was a failure, and while this is not a sufficient step to make up for it, it is a necessary step to make our system more just. We will do more to expand meaningful opportunity, particularly for our youth. We have to have more effective means for treating people We also have to have alternatives to incarceration, and we will have looking for other ways to have restorative justice and support our reentry efforts. I can't emphasize enough how much a conviction affects a person's life the moment it happens. It affects everything they do. Almost every application they do for a job or for housing will ask, have you ever been convicted of a crime? It really forecloses opportunities, everything from jobs to education to being part of who we are as a society. And so while we cannot reverse all the harm that was done, we can give back to those people a record that says they were not convicted, because that is the more just thing to do. For me, this is an important step in the kind of cycle of my career. You know, I grew up really believing you had to fight for the underdog, and one of the greatest opportunities I had coming out of law school and in law school was to work alongside public defenders representing people charged with crimes in the city of Seattle. All my first cases were in Seattle Municipal Court. And I saw firsthand at that time, and as a criminal defense lawyer over the years, the devastating impact the criminal justice system can have on real people's lives. I really fought at the time for having something other than just incarceration and having an alternative to incarceration and treatment. We did not get that on the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. I then had the opportunity to work with then prosecutor Norm Manley to establish one of the first drug courts in the city of Seattle in King County. It helped people's lives. And when I worked for President Obama, I was lucky enough to help establish one of the first federal drug courts in the country and work with the President and the Attorney General to try to reverse really unjust convictions. Our system is supposed to be a system of justice. Justice means something. And today, I think we take a step closer to having more justice for people. We know that for far too many people, the damage has already been done. And it's a hard truth that the war on drugs not only was a failure, but it had implicit racial bias in it, both in Seattle, in the state of Washington, and across this country. The numbers really are staggering. In Washington state alone, you are almost 3 times more likely to be convicted of a marijuana crime if you were a person of color, if you're African American, than if you were white. Those numbers tell us that we were dealing with an unjust system. And that unjust system had ripple effects that continued throughout those people's lives and continue today. Being convicted of marijuana meant a permanent criminal record that traveled with people their whole life. For thousands of people, as I said, this really impacted their ability to get opportunity. So that's why I'm proud today standing here with Pete Holmes to announce that we will, as one action, ask the Seattle Municipal Court to vacate all of the misdemeanor marijuana convictions. Our action will affect a number of people who had those convictions during the period of time when it was still illegal to have marijuana in the state of Washington, but also when Seattle had already declared it to be its lowest priority. I will note that Pete Holmes has been leading on this issue since he came into office. When he came into office, he quit prosecuting marijuana possession laws. And that's why you'll see where the timing of this vacation starts. We have to do more. Pete and I have both in contact with Dan Satterberg, with state officials to see what they can do on the state level. In the city of Seattle, we only have authority over the misdemeanors. That's what happens in Seattle Municipal Court. In order to go to the felony level, it will take action by the state or county prosecutors. We hope this action spurs more people, more prosecutors, more officials in this state, in cities and counties, to take a similar action. To take those people whose lives really were changed and to say to them and admit to them, we as a society made a mistake. We can't give you back all those years, but what we can do is say we will erase that criminal conviction. And so we'll take questions after that, but at this moment I'd like to turn it over to Pete Holmes, who has some things to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Durkan. My remarks will be brief. I think she pretty much touched on all of the important policy issues. I do want to pick up on one thing that Mayor Durkan pointed out, and that was that the voters of Seattle almost 15 years ago had already spoken with a unified voice, a strong voice, that marijuana laws, if they could not be repealed, then at least needed to be treated as the lowest law enforcement priority. When I ran for office in 2009, I promised to make that a reality. And when I took office in January of 2010, we promptly dismissed all of the pending marijuana cases. And I have never filed one except that we understood one slipped by in that first few days of office where a plea was entered. And I'm anxious to find that particular one and make sure that that one is teed up right up front. You know, it's as I look at this, it's the prosecutor and the wonky lawyers. How do we undo a bad policy? The war on drugs commenced largely by President Nixon back in 1971. The legacy that has left this country as the #1 jailer nation, not to mention exacerbating institutional racism, has been a legacy that we all bear today and that we all are struggling with. This is one small move toward trying to undo that wrong. There have been many mechanical issues that ever since when I took office, the first was, of course, to do no harm. Don't charge a bad law. But the second step, of course, is let's change the bad law. That was initially culminated in 2011 in SB 2053, excuse me, that would have brought our system of medical marijuana up to the fore. But following that effort, we really knew we needed to go the full route, and that was to go with legalization in I-502. And I knew that in June of 2011, when we finally, at the end of that legislative session, went forward with a full legalization measure, that this was the appropriate course. Today, there are many concerns left with our system. It is growing. I would submit that of all the states that have legalized, 502 and the state of Washington are doing the best job of substituting a highly regulated industry in the place of wrong-headed governmental prohibition. We still have a ways to go. I remain concerned about the economic viability of the industry, which is why it is so important that we have enlightened leaders like Ollie Garrett here with the Liquor and Cannabis Board that are looking into these things. It is also important that those very same communities of color who suffered most greatly under prohibition and the war on drugs also find full participation in the legalized industry that we have in this state. All of these things are compounded, of course, by a new administration in Washington, D.C., which would like to turn back the clock. I think Mayor Durkan and I have already made it clear that we're going to do everything that we can in the city of Seattle to hold our gains and to make sure that we continue perfecting this system as an alternative to wrong-headed government prohibition. Thank you all for being here, and I'm also here for questions as well.
So thank you, and I omitted one thing while I introduced President Bruce Harrell. I want to recognize a couple things. Number one, we are in the heart of his district, but it's also the heart of his heart.
It's also my district.
And he has been unflagging voice for justice. Bruce and I have known each other a very long time, and in every conversation we've had over the years, he would make his point about how we had to do more, not just in the criminal justice system, but to really provide real economic opportunity for communities of color, and particularly for African Americans. And so, President Harrell, I want to thank you for your decades of work on that front. So we'll be happy to take any questions if there are any. David.
What's the, do you have any sense of how many people this potentially affects in Seattle specifically, and then also what exactly is the difference between expunging something and vacating?
Great question. So we're still working through the numbers because we want to make sure that the classification systems in the court records can sometimes be tricky. We think it will exceed 500 in the city of Seattle. The difference between a vacation means there is no conviction. Expungement means to remove even the fact of that from your records. That is a little bit more complicated process that we'll have to work with state authorities on to make sure that there's a more seamless process. One thing that's really good about what we're announcing here today is, unlike in states like California that had that restorative justice as part of their legal marijuana regime, you could go and petition. The people who have these convictions will not need to do anything themselves affirmatively. We will do that as a city for them. And we're in the process also of setting up a website. It's not live yet. they'll have a place, a portal where people who think that they have a conviction or want information can go information. That will take some time to get in place. So expungement means you remove it from the record. We're working to make sure that people can have access to that too, because it's important and it matters. And the vacation means it's as if you were never convicted.
Mayor, what has to happen mechanically to have these convictions vacated? Do you have to go to a judge? Does a judge make a ruling? And who ultimately will make that ruling?
I'm going to let Pete answer that, but we will do it as a blanket motion, but that's the city attorney's purview, so I'll let him just address that.
The current plan is, once we have decided the full scope, the number of cases is somewhere between 500 and 600. You know, some of these were for 18 and under 21. In other words, you have to be 18 and over for jurisdiction. I'm interested in seeing what the number of those cases are. But our idea is, in concert with the Seattle Municipal Court, and I have been in touch with presiding judge Karen Donahue, we want to make sure that they, as well as my office, have the resources to take care of this. A single motion seems to be the most efficient way to go, but we have to make sure that that still works with the court's resources and with ours. And as the mayor said, a portal that would help people to identify and alert us if we've missed any of these cases would be very important to making sure that the process is finished. But a single motion is what we're hopeful would be the most efficient way to do it.
So
Dan?
does Judge Donahue, is she the one who makes the final decision on this, and then you have a commitment from her that she's willing to do it in whatever way you work out with her?
I don't want to speak to the judge's discretion. However, this is an instance where the prosecutor is bringing the motion to vacate and dismiss. In those instances, there is very little discretion, if you would, on the part of the judge. We want to make sure, however, that we have done our job to make sure that we've identified any exceptional circumstances. If people with multiple convictions, if they've had any subsequent vacations, for instance, we want to make sure that we've done our work so that the court can feel comfortable with the prosecutor stepping forward and saying, this is no longer illegal. It is simply unjust to continue a conviction on a record for a crime that is no longer a crime.
And I'll add to that. I've also talked to Judge Donahue. The court is very supportive of this. They believe that she believes it's important as a motion of judgment. The law requires us to make a certain showing. We've been working together on that, and we're confident that we'll be able to make that showing, but the court just wants to make sure that the proper motion comes before them, and they can't prejudge it, but they're very supportive of it.
Timeline for that happening?
By early next week is when we hope to have it. And again, our intent is to have, we'll coordinate with the mayor's office to have a link on our website for the city where individuals can go and see if their cases are there. You know, an interesting piece of this is how much do you want to publish a list of names of 500 people who have marijuana convictions if our goal is to try and lessen the impact on personal lives? And so our intent is to go with case numbers. And then we will help people to identify their case number, their conviction number to their own identity.
So we have to work through the logistics of how people will know. We've got the court records that we're pulling. We want to make sure they're complete. That's why the website and portal is going to be important. So it'll be phased. And my guess is we'll have one motion that will have all those that we know about, but a system so people who may have been accidentally omitted from the list or have questions about it can go to the portal and bring that to the attention of the city attorney. Question up here.
Why is this only happening 5 years after the passage of I-502?
If I may?
Yeah.
Ever since 502 has passed, this is something that I've sought on a statewide basis. And it's an excellent question because while we have the ability to do that as an individual municipality, think of all of the counties and municipalities across the state. My goal has been, and unfortunately, a bill that would have accomplished this, that had been sponsored by 34th District Representative Joe Fitzgibbons, would have provided a streamlined process for individuals to seek vacation of their individual judgments. The mayor and I can speak for the city of Seattle, but we don't speak for the rest of the state. And this is important. I hope that in the next session, our example will lead the state to streamline the process for individuals with convictions across the state, even if their prosecuting authorities have not taken the initiative.
And again, I want to thank Pete for his leadership on this because we talked about this early in after I was elected. And we've been discussing since 502 was passed how you would accomplish what we're doing here today on a statewide basis. And in discussing it in the last week or so, and since I came in, you know, we believe justice should not wait. It is no answer to the people in Seattle who deserve this level of justice that we're waiting for everyone else to get on board. And so we're going to act where we can act, and we hope it's an example for others.
Did San Francisco step about a week ago have any bearing on the timing of this?
We saw that, and we had already been discussing it, and I think that what they're doing is great. And I hope that people look at San Francisco. Theirs is a little more complicated because they have misdemeanors and felonies, so I think it's going to take them longer to put theirs in place. We have only misdemeanors here, and that's all we can impact in the city of Seattle, but I think it can be a template and a model for other cities and counties to act.
How much of this is an evolution for you on this topic of marijuana, both from a local municipality issue and then also from a federal issue? You had a lot to deal with there in the prosecuting attorney's office.
You know, that is a really good question. I saw firsthand as a criminal defense lawyer what the real human toll was for the war on drugs. And I carried that with me to the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's why we set up the drug court, the first one of the first ones in the country. And it's why when we were doing I-502 and deciding first with medicinal marijuana, then recreational marijuana, Pete Holmes and I were working very closely together throughout those years as the Department of Justice framed the Cole Memorandum, because I think it is clear, and I think Ollie Garrett would agree with this, without a well-regulated, real legal system, you will have a thriving black market that makes that legal system impossible. So I think that having that framework where you had a federal actor making sure that you kept it in its lanes was important, and that you kept the focus. And if you look at the Cole Memorandum that came out of the Department of Justice that I helped craft, it was really focused on those actors who were really dangerous, not on small-time users, small-time possessors. So it has been an evolution in the sense of trying to get to this place where we can really start to make up for what we did in the 90s and early 2000s in so many lives.
If someone's looking for an apartment and you're vacating the conviction, but they still have an arrest on their record, how's that going to affect them?
So in Seattle, as you know, we banned the box. So landlords won't be able to ask that question. Or a job on that. So what they can say is the question's usually, have you been convicted of a crime? The answer is no. And once the conviction is vacated, it is no longer a conviction. The question that some people try to ask is, have you been arrested? That is been challenged more and more, but this hopefully will have a positive impact for people.
And if you could vacate felonies, prior felonies, you would? You're urging the state to
We
do that?
both have talked with Dan Satterberg and with Bob Ferguson to look at what statewide fixes there could be on this, and at the county level, they've got a more complicated scenario where rarely is it a standalone conviction, so I defer the questions on the felonies to them.
But if it gets to the point of where they are looking to move forward with it, that's something you would get behind?
Absolutely support it. I think it's the right thing to do.
It's also important to remember that possession is typically a misdemeanor anyway, except in the federal system. So even under the RCWs, it's simple possession. When it's a felony, it's typically involving distribution.
When you talk about 500 to 600 people over the course of a decade that we're looking at, from roughly 96, 97 to just before you came into office, it doesn't strike you immediately as that many. Or it didn't strike me as that many. Can you talk a little bit about just the numbers, why they're, is it because Seattle's attitude toward these has been fairly tolerant with the voters passing the measure in 2003? Is it because these were prosecuted elsewhere, in district court or wherever?
It's because, Gene, they were prosecuted elsewhere. Before 96, 97, the legislature passed a law that all misdemeanor crimes had to be prosecuted at the municipal level. Prior to that, they were prosecuted at the county level. So that's one of the reasons that, Mr. Satterberg, who I've spoken with, he's certainly quite sympathetic. He has a much greater logistical problem to deal with before he can speak definitively on this. But prior to 96, 97, they were all prosecuted in the county. The city of Seattle began prosecuting them, and so you got to really, it's a much more narrow window. It's roughly from 97 to 2000, end of 2009 that Seattle was prosecuting these. Beginning in January 1, 2010, we didn't prosecute them anymore.
We saw with the sanctuary city status that the federal government threatened some federal dollars coming into the city. Have you guys heard anything from the U.S. Attorney's Office or from the administration that if you guys made a move on this, that some sort of retribution would happen? And would you guys resist any sort of retribution like that?
For today's action?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think there'll be any retribution at the federal level. Even while I was U.S. Attorney, the federal government has not been charging possession of marijuana cases in this district for a very long time, unless it's very rare. And so I don't think, we have the sovereign authority to do what we're doing. And I think that it will maybe add to their view on where we are on the spectrum, but it should show them that we're as resolute as we mean. That when we say we're going to take certain actions and we're going to work for a more just system, we are going to work for a more just system. And I think that they take us at our word at that.
Maybe we'll have a tweet.
And one more question.
Last question, going once. Thank you very much for your time.